Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life. Not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show on iTunes, or use our RSS feed with your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter, Instagram, and SoundCloud at VMSPod, on Facebook at facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, on Tumblr at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and at YouTube, just by searching for Virtual Memories Show. You can support this podcast and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/VMSPod and set up your level of support. Every week you'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Now, it was a crazy week. Those of you who are longtime listeners and subject yourselves to this part of the show know that I was putting on a big conference for my day job last week. I was experiencing a great deal of anxiety about it. Went great. Turns out sweating over every single detail and not having any help actually helps, because the attendees and the speakers just saw everything as a seamless experience. A hotel did a great job managing everything. I overthought everything pretty much, but got some good advice, and everything went really nicely. Lots of good sessions, good networking events. People seem really happy about it, which means I have to do it again next year. But I admit, pretty burned out by the end, partly because normally when I go down to Maryland, it's by train, and this time because I had to bring posters and conference guides and all this other stuff, I drove down, which meant I had to drive back like 5 hours. I spent it with two of my pals from the trade association. They're member company guys, but people I'm good friends with. But still, sitting in a car for another 5 hours after that whole 2-day experience, it's kind of tiring. And I only got a few hours to recharge when it was all over, because my old man had a health scare in the middle of the next day, and we've been kind of working with that since then. It's turned out fine. It's just that he's hospitalized, but we'll spring him tomorrow. Still, that's just kind of kept me from settling down post-conference. On the plus side, and there's always a plus side, you know that with me, over the weekend I had this epic podcast/gab session with a legendary guest, somebody you'll be hearing from later this month. The thing is, this guy's had this ridiculously storied career, and we talked about that stuff, but also he's in his late 80s, and he spent a bunch of time early on just talking about his dad and his coming up and deciding to pursue a completely different field than his old man, and some of the expectations and feelings he'd had over the years. And, well, you know, the day before that, I'm sitting in the emergency room with my old man and you know, trying to take care of him. And I thought, who am I to push this guy away from that subject? Like maybe I needed to hear him talk about that relationship and about his father and get me out of, you know, my own little circle that I was in. Anyway, you're going to hear that one in a couple of weeks. I'm apologizing for it in advance because it's like 2.5 hours long, but trust me, I think it's worth it. Anyway, this time around, you're going to get 2 shorter episodes. And it's a brand new podcast with old guests. Last week, I told you I went to the CXC Cartoon Crossroads Columbus Festival, partly to get away from thinking about my conference, and partly because a moderator who was going to handle a bunch of sessions had to cancel, and I offered to, well, I was press ganged into filling in. And those sessions that I covered turned out to be some pretty good episodes of the show. So those are with Mimi Pond and Pete Bagge. Our first guest is Pete Bagge. Pete did the show, or Peter Bagge, as he's known now that he's a biographer. Pete did the show in 2013 at the Small Press Expo. That's where we first met. It was where his first comic book biography came out, Woman Rebel, the Margaret Sanger story. This time around, he has a new biography, Fire, the Zora Neale Hurston story. And I enjoyed both of them a lot. And thought it was pretty neat to talk about the shift Pete made from semi-autobiographical fictional comics into biography, and that's a chunk of what we discuss in this one. And then what it takes to do a biography, or what it takes not to include every single neat detail that you find. I think I dug Fire more than Woman Rebel. I think maybe because Hurston's story is more interesting. Might also be that Pete is getting better and better at this biography form, that, maybe her story has, more thematic elements to it than Margaret Sanger's, but I just feel that this book holds together a lot better and really swept me along. And Pete's notes in the back of the book are fantastic, but you can read it without having to do all the annotations, too, but they're pretty entertaining. Anyway, they're both really strong books, and they form this pretty great complement to those early books of his, the Hate and Neat Stuff comics. Hate remains one of my all-time faves, which is why I love sitting down with Pete. I've been a fan of his since I was in college, which now means more than half my life ago. It was a lot of fun to record with him, and we also just got to hang out and shoot the breeze during the show, and that was kind of nice. It's kind of neat, just having an easy conversation with your hero. Here's Pete's bio from the Drawn and Quarterly website. Alternative comic creator Peter Bagge is best known for the 90s comic series Hate, featuring the semi-autobiographical anti-hero Buddy Bradley, whose adventures have been collected in 2 volumes, Buddy Does Seattle and Buddy Does Jersey, both from Fantagraphics. Bagge has also created 3 graphic novels, Reset, Apocalypse Nerd, and Other Lives. The journalistic strips Bagge has done for Reason have also been collected into a book entitled Everybody is Stupid Except for Me. More recently, Bagge has written and drawn a full-length biographical comic, Woman Rebel, the Margaret Sanger story, from Drawn and Quarterly, and a collection of short biographical strips, Founding Father Funnies, from Dark Horse. His newest book is Fire, the Zora Neale Hurston story, from Drawn and Quarterly. Peter Bagge lives in Tacoma, Washington, with his wife Joanne and 2 darn cats. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation at CXC with Peter Bagge. I think it's about time to get started. The celebrity cartoonist is in the house.
Can everybody see back there?
Yeah, there's no presentation, there's no slides.
We don't have a podium, so I'm sitting on this GED book, so you could see me.
Soon you'll finally get your high school.
That's right. My ass is gonna get a high school diploma.
Get well educated. So hi, everybody. I'm Gil Roth. I'm the host of a podcast called The Virtual Memories Show, where I interview writers, artists, and cartoonists, and we're going to be recording this session. Our guest, who's the spotlight guest for this session, is Peter Bagge, who I could go on and on about, but I'm going to restrain myself to just the CXC guide description of Pete. Is that good by you?
Sure.
Alternative comics legend Peter Bagge is the award-winning author of the legendary 1990s alt comic series Hate, featuring slacker hero Buddy Bradley and his Archie Comics-like coterie of friends. Bagge recently completed 2 critically lauded cartoon biographies of major historical figures Margaret Sanger and Zora Neale Hurston. Let's welcome Pete Bagge.
Thank you.
Okay, so rather than a slideshow, we're going to launch right into questions from me, and then we'll take as many as we can handle from you guys. First question, why the shift to biographies?
It was a slow transition. Starting around the year 2000, I would say, I started doing more and more nonfiction work. I was doing comic book journalism, so to speak. The first time I did it was, of all things, for Details magazine. Art Spiegelman for a while. He worked out some deal with Details where they would send a cartoonist of Spiegelman's choosing somewhere to report on an event. So I went to like the HBO comedy festival. So this would have been like, God, this might have been like 99, something like that. I remember they sent Charles Burns to Milan to cover a fashion show. And the results of that were really strange.
The greatest one they did, though, was sending Ben Catcher to cover a surfing competition in Milan.
That sounds like Spiegelman was being a punk by that point.
Yeah, you could figure it out.
And that led to what I did for Details. That led directly to me working for like 15 years, going on longer than 15 years, doing these 4-page features for Reason magazine, which sometimes they'll send me somewhere, I'll go somewhere to cover something. So I became somewhat used to working in nonfiction. And then I did a graphic novel called Apocalypse Nerd, and to fill up the back pages, because it was serialized at first, to fill up the back pages, I was doing these short little biographies or short little stories about the Founding Fathers, which eventually became, I did enough to fill up a book called Founding Fathers Funnies.
Which is for sale at Table 2.
There you go, Table 2. I brought one whole copy, so you're going to have to fight over it. And what happened after that, then for a while, Discover Magazine hired me to do these 1-page biographies of various scientists when they had their eureka moments, which was I didn't know. I'm not a science guy, so I had to do a lot of Googling to find out who they were. They would send me a list of scientists. They go, you really have to do this guy, and I'm like, no idea who this person is. But that was a lot of fun. That came out really well. Until the publisher found out that the editor was paying me way too much money and was so pissed off that he wouldn't negotiate for a bit less. I hate when that happens. So anyhow, I was really enjoying doing these originally very short, sometimes 1-page biographical pieces. So then finally Reason magazine let me do, even though they always would just give me 4 pages to work with, they let me do a 3-part story about a woman author named Isabel Patterson. She was an author, a novelist, and a polemicist eventually. She had very strong political opinions, which is what got her fired from, I think it was the New York World or the New York Herald. But she was best known for 25 years for being a book critic. She had a weekly column called Turns of the Bookworm. And she was the most feared book critic all through the 30s and 40s. And while reading about her and researching her, I became very interested in a lot of people who were a lot like her, had a lot in common with her. And that was specifically women creators, writers mostly, or activists, who lived in this certain period, who lived where their most active years would be between the 2 world wars. But these women also had something in common. They were incredibly independent. And this was before second wave feminism. It was before the 60s, women's rights movement. But something I noticed about these women is they never asked for permission to do anything. They just did whatever they wanted to do. And just simply waited or in anticipation for somebody to tell them that they couldn't. And I was just shocked at how brave they were. Brave compared to how most people are today. Even not just women, but men. It's like they were just utterly fearless and rarely suffered for it greatly. So the first of these biographies I did, I should back up a little bit and pitch this idea to Joint and Quarterly. And I asked them mainly, first and foremost, because I knew the publisher, Chris Oliveros. So I figured I should ask, before I'd ask somebody like at Pantheon, because I don't know anybody personally at Pantheon, so I just figured I'll ask somebody I know first. The reason I went to him as opposed to Fantagraphics is I'd been told that Joint and Quarterly will give you at least would consider giving you a generous advance, and Fantagraphics doesn't. So, and I needed that advance because I knew these books were going to take years just to research. Each one of them is taking me 3 years to do. And they'll give me a decent advance, but I burned through that advance in like 3 months. And then I find myself doing things like selling my house. So the first one was on Margaret Sanger. And I wanted to do her first largely because she was an advocate for birth control. And if you read the book, or if you're familiar with her or read any of the books about her, birth control, even sharing information about birth control, was illegal when she started. You go to jail. And at one point she had to leave the country to avoid jail time. She spent time in Europe. And then when she came back, she stood trial. And she did eventually, but for starting the country's very first birth control clinic, she wound up going to jail for a while. But it was largely because of her efforts that these other women that I'm writing about, to some degree or another, were also able to live free, independent lives. Because prior to that, women, by extension men, were slaves to their biology. You know, it's a big reason why women didn't have careers, was because they get pregnant and have babies. And that slows you down. So that's why I chose to do her first. The second one I did was the woman I was most excited about writing about, and that is Zora Neale Hurston, who's African-American author who is best known for a novel called Their Eyes Are Watching God. But she also was an anthropologist. She also had very strong political opinions, and towards the end of her life wrote a lot of political essays. In fact, I would say for the last she wrote her last novel around 1946 or 47, and she died in 1960. So during those years, she pretty much only wrote articles and essays and editorials, and mostly dealing with the politics of the time. But again, led a very, very fascinating life, and she's a unique person for countless reasons. I thought about doing her first, but then both Oliveros and I thought it'd be best if we did Sanger first. I know you told me you were going to ask me about this. Another thing too that I brought up with Chris Oliveros was, I'm not immune to the politics of the time, especially these days. And I said to him, do you think it might be more trouble than it's worth for a white man to write a book about a black woman? Do you think like the pushback or any difficulty you might have as a publisher and a distributor, do you think that would outweigh it? And all Chris Oliveros said was, do you feel inspired to write this book? Do you want to? And I said, yeah. And he says, well, then do it. That usually leads to a good book, so go ahead and do it.
And had you gotten any pushback in terms of either the gender or cultural appropriation crowd?
Well, yeah, a tiny bit. Nothing bad, but like on Twitter, some people said...
So people will say anything on Twitter.
Yeah, people will say anything on Twitter, and I had to be... It always was... I was mostly reading very nice things about the book on social media, and it was very well reviewed. It got great reviews. And so it was always other people who seemed like, especially people who worked at Joint and Quarterly, who were very nervous about this. Oliveros wasn't, but he's like semi-retired from the company. Mm-hmm. Everybody else seems, and in fact, they told me, after the book came out, they told me that some of their interns are against the book. They actually hired people that think this book shouldn't exist because of who wrote it. So I was directed to some tweets, and there was somebody who said, I think it was, I never heard of the person, but I believe it was a he. Yeah, it was, said, why wasn't a woman of color assigned to do this book? And of course I was like, assigned? Really? It's like, I know the answer to that is because none of them want to do it.
Well, there's that whole idea of waiting for permission.
Yeah, waiting for permission. They need to read this book. Be more like Zora Neale Hurston. But I was like, what kind of mentality is that? Are they still in the 7th grade? What the fuck? And it was like, I spent 3 years on the book. Nobody asked me to do it. Had to sell my fucking house. It's like, come on, women of color, you do the same thing,
Now, we'll ask, though, within the book, there's an episode with Mary Barnacle, where Zora Neale Hurston freaks out because this woman is taking a picture of a young black child eating watermelon, and she thinks it's going to be perceived in a horrendously racist way.
Right, she was triggered. There's actually, and I superimposed the page that you're talking about. I deliberately superimposed 2 pages. Each one's like a 1-page vignette in the Zora Hurston book, Fire. And each one she's with, at the time, a very young anthropologist, Alan Lomax, who some of you may have heard of, and who she adored. It was like she practically treated him like the son she never had. So in one page, I show them going to a church in the very deep rural South. It's like borderline Gullah country, or was in Gullah country in the Carolinas or Georgia, on one of the Sea Islands. And Lomax got there first, and he had the recording equipment in his car. They would go to such remote places that Lomax had to power the recording equipment with his car. There'd be no electricity. It was the only power source. And it was really cumbersome, compared to like a cell phone now. His recording equipment was really awkward. And he got there early on purpose to set up. But all of a sudden, somebody at their church was like, oh no, you're not coming in here. We don't know who you are. You're some weird northern white guy and with some crazy looking stuff in your car. So he was like, oh well. And when Hurston came, she got into an argument with whoever the head church lady was. They were playing the dozens, just insulting each other. And they were insulting each other, casually making such violent threats that Lomax really thought that they were going to get into a fight, that they were actually going to physically attack each other. But it worked, and they got in. And so Lomax said, how did you manage to do that? And Hurston went, well, hey, when it comes down to it, I can out-nigger anybody. And it was funny, striking, and Lomax remembered that story, and it was striking how she would very casually use the N-word in front of a white guy, But it showed how loosey-goosey and how you would say unpolitically correct she was. In fact, I heard about this after a story I read about after I finished the book was they were down south. I don't know what she was thinking. She was being a total punk, but they were going to go to a party, and everybody was going to be black at the party except for Lomax. And Lomax again was like, so it's cool that I go to this party, right? And she says, you know what we're going to do? We're going to disguise you as a black guy. And she put Lomax in blackface. Yeah. And he went along with it. She goes, this will work. And he's going to, and of course inside she was laughing her head off, because here you are in a party, and there's a guy that you're sitting next to, well, obviously wearing black, and she was like telling everybody, this is my black friend. But then I superimposed that on the very next page with, they were traveling on this same trip, Lomax and Hurston, with a white woman from the north who was like Hurston's age, and her name was Mary Barnacle. I'd never read anything bad about this woman. She was very involved with Lomax's father, John Lomax, and making Leadbelly famous. She was a very radical professor at NYU. She used to get fired from NYU for preaching free love in her classes. But while they were down south, Hurston hated Barnacle for 2 reasons. They were both competing. They both wanted to monopolize Lomax. They were both separately trying to recruit him for future projects. And they both were acting like it was like a mommy war between the two of them with Lomax. But also Barnacle was such a dyed-in-the-wool leftist, which Hurston was beginning to hate. She hated communists, hated communism, hated socialism. Barnacle was far left. Basically, Hurston was it's not like she hated Nazis too. She hated fascism. She hated totalitarianism. I'm getting a bit far afield now, but she hated, top-down societal control. She believed that everything should be organic, that cultural changes and shifts should be from the bottom up and leave people to their own devices. So she hated Mary Barnacle for that reason as well, politics. But it all came to a head when she saw Mary Barnacle taking a picture of a little black boy eating a watermelon. And she was completely triggered. She goes, oh my God, you're going to take that picture and you're going to show it to all of your leftist Yankee friends and talk about how cute he is and how you were down here mixing with us poor Southern black folk. Just totally exploded. Ran inside, wrote an angry letter to Alan Lomax's dad, it's hilarious, the letters that she wrote to John Lomax, literally tattletaling on this woman.
Yeah, what was the toughest part of research? And what have you gotten better at in terms of, having gone through 2 of these biographies now, have you learned certain ways of, okay, I don't need all of this, to boil down to...
The toughest is you want to read everything existing, all biographical information on these people. Mm-hmm. But sometimes like with Sanger, unfortunately, I'd be 20 pages into something before I realized this is just all lies. This is BS. Almost always written by somebody who's very much it's ironic. Sanger was also personally against abortion, but because she formed Planned Parenthood, she to this day has been successfully, thoroughly demonized deliberately and lied about by people who are against abortion and extremely conservative religious types. It was a handful of people that made up lies about her, but then it became a meme on the internet that she's a racist and a eugenicist and all this stuff. And they took a lot of quotes that she said out of context or made a whole bunch up. There's all these Photoshop pictures of her in a car with Hitler, even though her books were banned by Hitler. So I had to. That was a big part of it too, is like separating the wheat from the chaff and recognizing that that's a bunch of BS right away. Again, it's not quite that extreme. But again, for political reasons, that also occurs with Hurston, because Hurston is greatly admired for a lot of reasons. Like in the 1930s, she was pretty much her official biographer, Valerie Boyd, said, as far as she could tell with all of her research, she says by the mid-1930s, Hurston was the only black female writer in the country. She was like the only one left, partly because of the Depression, and also just because she wouldn't quit. And she wrote great books that still are a great inspiration to lots of people, and particularly women of color, because she herself was a woman of color. So she was a great role model, and a role model of people like Alice Walker and a lot of people who came after her. And they either don't know about, or they lie, or just have a blind spot about Hurston's politics. They just figured, well, I love Hurston's work. I love Alice Walker's work. Alice Walker is a hard leftist in good standing. Hurston must be too, And so especially mainly only on the internet, she'll just be described that way. Or people, it's almost always women of color. They want her to be just like themselves. And I've met on the tour that I did, that speaking engagements I've done, of course, a lot of black women would come to hear about Hurston, and then they'd come up and say, so Hurston was a deep, deep woman of faith, right? And I said, well, actually, she described herself as agnostic, or probably agnostic is the most specific she got, even though there was all these, her titles were almost always biblical references. But that had everything to do with her father being a preacher and the culture she grew up in. Was steeped in the Bible. And she quoted the Bible all the time. She just didn't take it literally. And they, the woman would have this, they would come to these talks with their church lady hats on. And they were just totally convinced that she was a woman of faith. And the opposite. There was one woman in Seattle who was just like, what I love, the reason I respond so much to Hurston is she was an atheist. It's like, no, she wasn't. She wasn't that either. But it's like, you can't, she was like, nope, she was an atheist.
The books, while they're funny enough, you have enough humorous anecdotes about these people's lives, you also tackle relatively serious moments in the courses of their lives. Your cartooning is so inherently funny bones. How do you try to balance that? How do you try not to draw a serious moment without it, having a sort of Pete Bagge?
Right.
Yeah. Like the eyes,
Well, first of all, my favorite artwork has always been something that on the surface looks slapstick and silly, but there's something deep going on in the undercurrent, and that's something that I always strive for in my own work. And I noticed that. So it's like, to me, it's yin yang, where it's like on the surface it looks stupid, but or just it looks like all surface humor, but then there's something deep that has this ballast to it, and it's something that I developed. I feel eventually successfully while I was doing neat stuff back in the 80s. I did this one story. I did like a issue-length story with Buddy Bradley called Hippie House. And it touched on some things that happened to me and that I did when I was a teen that I was still somewhat embarrassed about. And I was afraid to write about it, honestly. I really thought the readers would make fun of me. And at the time I talked to Robert Crumb about it because we were still working on Weirdo together. And Crumb was like, you got to do it. You have to do it. That's when you know you have to do something. He goes, it's like jumping into a pool of water.
When you're taking your inhibition advice from Robert Crumb.
Oh, right. Well, it's worked for him. So I was like, he just said it's like jumping into a pool of water. It's scary at first. You're going to be cold for a second, but then it's fine. And he was right. It's like instead of the readers making fun of me, they were all like, I did that too. I totally relate to that. I can't believe you talked about that. And they would say I cringed too. I cringed for my own sake reading about this. It's certain works of art that really inspired me, that knocked my socks off. Like for one example, Annie Hall. Annie Hall was like that, where it would be really silly. All of a sudden there'd be like a brief bit of animation in it. And like when Woody Allen's a little kid and he's going, I'm your uncle, Joey Nichols, and he slaps, and then the kid turns around and just goes, what an asshole. Except then the movie gets sad. It gets sad and deep, It gets very profound. It's about a really painful breakup. And I loved that. I was like, this is amazing.
This is the original story, that it was a murder mystery, right?
Yes. Okay, yeah. Which eventually made Manhattan Murder Mystery.
Yeah, which not so good.
But. Actually, I liked it, but yes. Anyhow, what we were talking about. Oh, yeah, like with doing this, it's mainly what happened with these biographies in particular. What I knew would happen, and it did happen, is there were people who were not familiar with my work, but who are like already invested in, say, Margaret Sanger or Zora Neale Hurston. So if you go to Goodreads.com and there's people writing their reviews, there'd be tons that would be like, from almost always women's studies majors, and they'd say, I love Margaret Sanger, love the subject matter of this book, learned a lot, but I'm shaving off 1 star because I can't stand the way this guy draws. and now it's the same thing is happening with women's studies and African studies majors with Hurston. Yeah, this is I gotta knock off a star because this guy's artwork is so hideous. And then it was also, especially with younger readers, because my artwork is so like old-fashioned and slapstick and deliberately like Warner Brother cartoon looking. To some people, it brought back vague memories they had of like Coal Black and the Seven Dwarves. So they immediately thought I was like just making like there was one pretty negative review that I got, and it was by she described herself as a woman of color. I don't know, like she could have been Japanese, I don't know, but she. And she read the whole book, but then she mainly dissed it because she said, with the way he drew her, I feel like he's making fun of her. And that also made my head explode. It's like, 3 years on this book, and you read the whole book, and you think I'm making fun of her?
Like you said, people bring their agendas to whatever they're reading.
Yeah, they do. So I knew that it would be weird, and it gave me a little bit of pause too, like, am I the right person to draw this? But the way I draw is the way I express myself. And even if it's serious subject matter, I'm going to draw this way because it's how, it's my signature style for a reason. I like the way it looks, and I'm comfortable drawing it this way. Again, like plenty of people, even friends of mine are like, shouldn't you maybe consider collaborating with somebody who draws like realistically? Make it look like that, Representative Lewis book.
Oh,
you know?
March.
Yeah. But I was
Nate's
like, no,
here.
because then I wouldn't have wanted to read it. But when the book, Art Spiegelman told me that when he first saw Woman Rebel, Jordan Quarterly just sent it to him. And he says, at first he didn't read it, he just looked at it. He goes, the Margaret Sanger story by Peter Bagge. And he said, what's next? The Martin Luther King story by Don Martin? And I tell all my friends that story. Like I told Dan Klaus that story, and he goes, I would buy that in a heartbeat.
Now, let me ask, in the last year or so, and you've got a copy over there, Neat Stuff got collected and put out by Fanta.
Yes.
Did you review that work at all? Were you looking at that stuff as it was being collected and being prepared? And in the process, did you look back at who you were as a cartoonist in the 80s versus where you are now? Did it make you think, I guess?
Well, oddly, when we were putting that book together, I was so bogged down in logistics of like finding whatever original art I still had and collating it and just getting everything together and just lots of back and forths with Gary and Eric and Paul Baresh, their production guy, that I didn't sit down and reread them. Although something happened, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. It's like 10, 15 years ago, all of a sudden it was like in my 40s. I guess it was like male menopause. I suddenly felt like very different physiologically. And I felt like it was starting to be reflected in my work. And I became very self-conscious of it when I did around that time. This was like the early aughts, I would say. I reread particularly the work I did in the 80s, Neat Stuff and Weirdo, and especially like the editorials that I would write in Weirdo. And I was like, who is this guy? I don't recognize this guy. He's so angry. What a little pissant. What am I so pissed at? I can remember what really made me laugh, too, is I can't remember if it was in Neat Stuff or the first issue of Hate or Weirdo. Must have been Neat Stuff, where the 80s were about to turn into the 90s. And I wrote an editorial. I can't quote it, but roughly I was like saying, the 80s suck so bad that I'm predicting that the 90s are going to be called the I wish we were dead decade. And then the 90s turned out great. And when I was like, why would I like make a prediction like that? Jesus Christ.
Who we are in our 20s should never be held against us.
Yes. That's the funny thing, too, that expression, bitter old men. But even when I was a young man, I always thought that was strange. Because I was like, nobody's more bitter than a young man. Yeah, even when I was young, I knew I was bitter, and all my friends were bitter. And old guys weren't, generally speaking. You know, I guess if they were homeless or something, you know. But I was like, why does that term get assigned to older men?
Hey, and I know this is a horrible topic to bring up, especially in a room full of people involved in comics. You mentioned selling the house as part of the process of doing this. Can you talk a little about the economics or the making a living in comics?
Well, I don't do a lot of note comparing. When I do, or if another cartoonist breaks it up, there has been a general thing where, but it's mainly like a lot of my peers, and again, not all of them. I can't speak for everybody, but a lot of people who've been cartooning like me for a long time. It's just for all kinds of reasons. It's just getting harder and harder to make a living. You know, it's like, it's not like I'm poor, but it's my income has been, it's not what it was like all through the aughts. I was doing great, but and since then it's just gotten to be more and more of a struggle. So all the more reason why it was completely insane that I decided to do these biographies. But with the biographies too, I hope I can make myself clear. It was a little bit ironic that while it was getting a bit tougher to make a living, I at the same time chose to do something that I knew would, at least out of the gate, would be a real struggle, which is these biographies. But that was also a reaction to it, because I found myself running around looking for any old thing to do and doing work that I was not excited about, or working with a publisher I was not excited about working with, and not for great money. So it's like, well, if I'm going to do something that I could take or leave for not terrific money, I might as well just do something that I definitely want to do, that I have no doubts about, which would be these biographies, and just take my chances. you know? So, critically it's paid off, and I'm happy with it. I'm very proud of these books, but they just take way too goddamn long to make. Maybe I don't have to do as much research as that's like another thing, too, that I worry about all the time, is that people who know a lot about Sanger or Hurston or their descendants are going to write to me saying, you totally got this wrong, you got that wrong. So it just reaches this, when I'm researching it, at a certain point I reach this point where it's like I'm kind of reading the same stuff over and over again.
Looking for the consistencies?
Yes. Although there have been great anecdotes, like the one of putting Alan Lomax in blackface. I'm not so sure I would have included that in the book, but mainly because I don't know for sure where Hurston was coming from when she did that. It had to have been a joke. She had a very perverse sense of humor. She did a lot of weird things. Like for example, she was very good friends with Fannie Hurst, who in the 1920s and 30s was like the best-selling author in the country, although she's pretty much forgotten now. And so they were like an odd couple friendship. And they knew it, and Hurston was always aware of it, too. And also Fannie Hurst was the epitome of the limousine liberal, that type of northern do-gooder that drove her crazy. But she liked her in spite of that. But they once they used to go on road trips together, and they went down south, and they went to Eatonville, which is Hurston's hometown. And Hurston's father was like the mayor of Eatonville, and he was a successful carpenter and a successful preacher, very successful preacher, that had a 7-acre home where they grew most of their own food. This home that her father built, he was a master carpenter. It was beautiful. But once they got to Eatonville, Fannie Hurst said, so where did you grow up? What house did you grow up in? And she just looked around and she saw this crumbly little shotgun shack and she said, there, that's the house I grew up in. And Fannie Hurst started crying. She was like, oh my God, sorry, you grew up there? Oh my God. And what a dick move. And she was like, yep. She never said, no, just busting your balls. It's that palace. Or she was just like, yep, I mean, it was rough.
Was she your favorite side character in this? You seem like you have some affection for some of the secondary
she was
people.
very good friends with, she had very wacky relationships with both Fannie Hurst, her closest white people friends, Fannie Hurst and Carl Van Vechten. And Fannie Hurst and Carl Van Vechten, all by themselves, they were real characters. They accomplished a lot themselves. They'd be worthy of a graphic novel
We'll
biography.
ask about the sequel next. But.
Yeah, the thing is, I don't admire them as much as artists, but they were very remarkable people. Plus, I know this is like a dumb prejudice, but they were also both born rich. So, I like a little bit of that, Horatio Alger.
There's a great biography of James Merrill, who is the epitome of being born rich and actually achieving something as an artist. But yeah, otherwise, I'm with you.
Right. I like that. Do you want that struggle?
Yeah. Is there a next? Who are you looking at?
I am already knee-deep in a third biography. This one's about a woman named Rose Wilder Lane, who is best known, I would say, unfortunately, as the daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote The Little House on the Prairie books. But Rose Wilder Lane co-wrote all of those books with her mother, which is like, when biographers first floated that idea, they got death threats. The Laura Ingalls Wilder, there's a lot of, she has a real cult following, which consists almost entirely of Midwestern white women. And they could get violent if you would diss Laura Ingalls Wilder. And not to take nothing away from Wilder. She was a remarkable woman. But her daughter was already a professional and a successful writer in her own right. She was a lot of what she wrote is out of print, but you still could find some of them. But she was a successful novelist and a journalist, and also a political polemicist. So it's like, I was drawn to her, but she was the person that coined the term libertarian. And me being a libertarian, that's one of the first things that made me interested about her. And she, for a brief period, of course, not surprisingly, they all wound up hating each other. But Isabel Patterson, who I talked about before, and Rose Wilder Lane, and Anne Rand, who's by far the most famous, they all wrote books at the same time that very much advocated this idea that later became known as like libertarian thinking. So like people called them the three sirens of the libertarian movement. But as is typical of libertarians too, they couldn't stand being in the same room with each other after a while.
You notice that?
Yes. And they particularly hated Ayn Rand, which is totally understandable. But reading it, the more I read about it, sure, politics was more like she even said she was an anarchist. And she would reluctantly agree that we needed, or now the term that people use is minarchist, which is like absolute minimum amount of government. I know the terminology gets, but because anarchy means all sorts of things. Emma Goldman was an anarchist, but she would have little in common with Rose Wilder Lane. But again, the same with Sanger and with Hurston. She led an insane life. She led a life that you can't believe was humanly possible. It's like she couldn't have been in all these places, but then you can verify that, yes, she was, just traveling constantly and just led a crazy existence. And she herself was an excellent writer. Her own writing was fantastic. And her mother's writing was very raw. Her mother had she had a great memory, great recall. And so people loved to hear her mother tell stories. But her mother's own writing experiences was she wrote a column for a regional paper called The Ruralist. And it was just advice for farmers' wives, the best way to can peaches and things like that. So that was her only writing experience. But to write a whole novel, to build character, to have plot shifts, all that, she didn't have a clue. So her daughter had to write it all with her. A lot of people who love the books, but have a problem with this extreme anti-government politics of her daughter, Rose Lane. When they see any hints of that very conservative, old school liberty, get the government out of the way politics, they like to think. Again, this is people projecting. They like to think that was the daughter imposing her views on her mother. But here's the thing: is like when FDR got elected, Rose Lane in her diary she wrote, "I hope somebody assassinates FDR, and I would do it myself if I could get close enough." Consider that she wrote that, and that her mother hated FDR even more.
Is there a time frame for that one? Or
33. It was when he first got elected.
No, I mean for the next book.
Oh, the book. That book is going to come out 2019, I believe. I think mid or late 2019.
Before we turn over to audience questions, I have a sort of meta question about your career in terms of shifting in this direction. You're best known still for Buddy Bradley and the Hate comics,
right?
I think. And I wonder what it's like having an alter ego figure who you seem to have outgrown. The Buddy stories have obviously they've slowed down in terms of frequency. The lives have diverged enough. Do these women that you're doing biographies of now stand as a sort of alter ego of you, reflecting, the sort of life or at least the political life that you've chosen and how you represent that in art? And what's it like?
I never thought of it that way, but yeah, that sounds pretty close to the truth. You win a sticker.
I always get with a one deep psychological question.
Okay.
But yeah, what's it like having an alter ego figure who you sort of, kind of outgrown the Buddy?
Well,
stories?
I didn't outgrow Buddy. He was always a stand-in for me, and he was always self-consciously 10 years younger than me. And of course, our lives were like parallel, not identical. He wasn't a cartoonist. I never owned a scrap metal yard, but I wanted to keep doing it. I always had ideas for him, which again was just a synthesis of things that happened to me like 10 years previous. And so I had plenty of story ideas. And so once a year I would put out a Hate Annual. And it would be, I would reprint a lot of material of work that I had done from far and wide. A lot of stuff that I did for the internet that I just wanted in print. But I would always have a Buddy Bradley story in there, and I was still aging him. The problem was I lost the readership. Fewer and fewer people were reading it. And there was just less feedback. So it's like, Well, nobody wants to read about this eccentric old guy and his wife and kid,
No, that's a whole room of these guys who want to.
Well, you're in the minority. And it's not. It doesn't surprise me. I became very aware of it, especially once I made a big switch with Hate in the 90s where there was like the Seattle stories, the black and white ones, and it's Buddy being a young single guy. And then I switched it. I had reasons to. I wanted to go deeper, so I had Buddy Bradley move back to New Jersey, mainly because I wanted to work old people and little kids into the story. I didn't want it to be about so focused on 20-somethings living in a hip neighborhood anymore. And I thought it got a lot better. I thought the stories were so much better and deeper, but they weren't quite as popular as the earlier ones. Which at first confused me, but then when I look at the early ones, and to this day I still think it's like, this is Archie. It's a love triangle. Buddy is Archie, and then there were the two girls were,
very
Lisa and Valerie, and then George C. Simonton was Jughead, and Stinky was Reggie. And I was like, who's Buddy gonna date now? But people love that shit. It was relationship crap. It was relationship crap. Boy meets girl. Everybody loves that stuff, even if they don't want to admit it to themselves. I mean, it's like, there were plenty of people who love that stuff who don't like anything else I've done.
Let's open to you guys. Questions from the audience? Someone, for Christ's sake. Okay, shoot.
I know that you have two wonderful, strong, smart women in your family. Do they have any requests of you for biographies coming up? Do they have a list of, hey, do this one, do this one next, and then...
Mainly because I talk about him so much, and I'm both a huge fan, but also I find him hilarious. My wife wants me to do a comic biography of Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys.
Oh, wow.
But he's still alive. You're going to find out... For all of the crazy stuff that I already do know about him, I know it's just the tip of the iceberg. I've done for Vice online, I did a few short stories that friends of mine told me.
Those rock and roll stories?
Yes.
Stories about, yeah.
Yeah, well, like one friend, Tom Kenny, who was the voice of SpongeBob, he told me about going out, he had dinner with, and I made a comic about it, with Brian Wilson and Frankie Valli of the Four Seasons. So he says, you can't miss this. You just can't miss this. And they hadn't seen each other since like 1965 or something like that. So as soon as Brian Wilson, sorry if you already read the comic book, but Tom Kenny said Brian Wilson went, Frankie Valli, I can't believe it. This is so exciting. I can't believe it. He goes, dinner's on me, everybody. Dinner's on me. And Brian Wilson has always ate like a pig. Brian Wilson would always, both him and other friends of mine who know him say he'll always immediately scarf down all the sugar cubes in the sugar cube bowl and then ask for more. He's a real compulsive eater. And so Brian Wilson just ate like a pig, and then he just went like, oh boy. He goes, excuse me, I gotta go. And they just figured he meant going to the bathroom. But then Frankie Valli of the Four Seasons, just in case anybody doesn't know who he is, he looks out the window, he sees Brian Wilson getting into his car and driving away. And he's, oh, look at that guy. Look at that guy. Can you believe this shit? Dinner's on me. Dinner's on me. Can you believe this shit? But then Frankie Valli stopped himself. Tom King says, I swear I'm not making this up. Valli stopped himself, and then he went, oh, but you know what? I knew him back in the day. I blame the drugs. And then he goes, my daughter went through that. Did you see the play?
Next. Back there, yeah.
Or if you have a perspective on, like, so you have like the stories about early Seattle in the 90s, and then do you still live in Seattle now?
I just moved to Tacoma.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah, much cheaper town.
It's really funny to hear your perspective of just like how the city changed over, like, from the early 2000s till now. If you have, I'm sure you
Well, it's booming. The economy is booming. It's the home of Microsoft, Starbucks, and Amazon. So it's like three companies that are just taking over the universe. And Amazon in particular right now, it's like the town is just flooded with people who they can't find anywhere to live. Traffic is insane. Skyscrapers everywhere. And what always seems to come with that exploding prosperity is zillions of homeless people all over. So besides economics, that's like don't miss Seattle when I moved last year. It's like it was getting to be a bit too much. My neighborhood in particular, I've only been gone for a little more than a year, and I barely recognize the neighborhood. So many houses and buildings have been torn down. And I don't know how a young artist could, why they'd even consider moving to such an expensive place, you know. They should move to Columbus.
Questions? My last one, nope, you're not gesturing. What are you better at in terms of drawing, or in terms of cartooning? What do you look back at and think, holy shit, I could not do X back when I was young? And don't say drawing horses.
I still can't draw horses. Real quick, just to respond to that last comment. Lots of times I think about doing biographies of people whose entire lives predated the automobile.
That was Mimi Pond's thing, too. Couldn't do cars to save her life, she said.
She can't draw cars? I was just like, so I thought about people from like the 1800s, and then I just think, all those horses. Yeah. So that's the only reason you'll never see a Frederick Douglass comic out of me is because of horses.
No one else has any questions?
But I still want to answer your question. I think just more concise storytelling, being less verbose, which is something I still struggle with. Things like just being really concise with my storytelling, having a really economic page. You know, that's just I think that's something that because that's something I'm always striving for and striving towards.
I just wonder about that in relation to the biographies, how you really trim down, and most of them, like you said, are 1 or 2 page
it's little vignettes
as opposed to 70 pages of story.
Right.
But I figured you'd go on forever talking about concision. So I figured we'd let that go.
Oh, yeah. Well, a lot of people miss the really explosive drawing style that I used to indulge in, especially in neat stuff. Like in neat stuff, there would be I talked about trying to do these Buddy Bradley stories that would run a little bit deeper, but then I would do pages features that were just an excuse to draw really exaggerated faces and characters, just be like Basil Wolverton, Big Daddy Roth. I was Bob Clampett, very inspired by those guys, and just wanted to see how far I could push it. And I would incorporate that in some stories. There was one story, a Bradley family story. I think it was Mom and Babs Bradley. And I was having a field day just drawing them fighting, like both verbally and physically. And the drawings were, even I was like, am I going too far? Because this is a story. I'm trying to tell a story. But the drawings are so crazy exaggerated. I was having fun with it. But in the back of my head, I was thinking, am I getting carried away with this? And then I can remember after that comic came out, once a year, I used to get a phone call from a comic reporter named Heidi McDonald. Do you know her?
Yeah.
And she used to always, once a year, she'd call me up just to talk about all the comics I had done that year for, I forget what publication, Amazing Heroes or something like that. And she called me up, and she goes, Pete, like that Babs Bradley story. And I go, yeah. And she goes, don't you think it's time to start dialing that shit back? And I was like, you know what?
You got it.
I had to hear somebody say it. So lots of times people tell me they miss that. I often am told that I miss when everybody was going completely crazy. But yeah, it just seems like too much. It doesn't seem natural.
You've got cleavers flying through the air and fire. You've got the Zora Neale Hurston book. You've got plenty of chaos.
Right.
But yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
There's no further questions. Let's thank Pete Bagge for the spotlight session.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
And that was Pete Bagge. His latest book is Fire, the Zora Neale Hurston story from Drawn and Quarterly. It's an awfully good book, as is Pete's previous comic biography, Woman Rebel, the Margaret Sanger story, also from D&Q. Pete's best known for his comic book Hate, which has 2 collections, as well as some uncollected annuals, all from Fantagraphics. Fanta also collected Pete's anthology from the 80s, Neat Stuff, last year in a slip-cased edition. It's pretty nice. But just hit peterbagge.com and you'll find all sorts of stuff. And that's PETER BAGGE.com. He's also on Twitter at PeterBagge1. And go to the Drawn and Quarterly and Fantagraphics websites and look up Bagge, B-A-G-G-E. You'll find his stuff, and he's really one of the greats. Now, the other session I moderated at CXC is with many-time guest Mimi Pond. I just posted a full-length episode with Mimi a few weeks ago when she was in New York on her book tour for The Customer Is Always Wrong, but I knew this audience likely hadn't listened to our podcast, so I repeated a couple of questions from that conversation during the panel because I knew Mimi could really kind of perform for those. I cut most of that from this version so as not to be too repetitive. You can go back just 3 or 4 weeks and find the Mimi Pond one. You'll get this great story about the waitress who did not make it into Over Easy and The Customer Is Always Wrong because she would have overwhelmed the entire graphic novel. So I loved the story she told me when we met in New York, so I kind of fed her that one again. Anyway, that's too much inside baseball. The other thing to know is I cut the first 2 questions from the audience Q&A section because those were about Mimi's experience writing for The Simpsons, and that is territory that bores the crap out of her. My other caveat, this spotlight session began with Mimi reading/performing from her new book, The Customer Is Always Wrong, also from Drawn and Quarterly. I didn't include that here because you sort of have to see the panels, not just hear her doing voices. That said, my opening question is a lift from something one of the characters asks Mimi, or Madge, in the book. Here's Mimi's bio. Mimi Pond is a cartoonist, illustrator, humorist, and writer. Her graphic memoir, The Customer Is Always Wrong, was recently published by Drawn and Quarterly. Her previous book, Over Easy, garnered a tremendous critical response, a place on the New York Times bestseller list, the Penn Center USA Award for Graphic Literature Outstanding Body of Work, and an Inkpot Award from Comic-Con International in San Diego. Pond has created comics for the LA Times, 17 Magazine, National Lampoon, and many other publications too numerous to mention, along with 5 humor books. She has also written for television. Her credits include the first full-length episode of The Simpsons in 1989 and episodes for the television shows Designing Women and Pee-wee's Playhouse. She lives in Los Angeles with her husband, the painter Wayne White. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation at CXC with Mimi Pond.
Humorist or artist?
At this point, both.
What do you consider stronger as far as your skills go?
Oh, don't make me choose.
Oh, it's Sophie's choice, exactly. But ask instead. We'll tread on.
I mean, what people are going to go? Yeah, the drawing.
But she's funny. Yeah. This book started as prose.
Yes.
And I know it's something you've talked about, but maybe the audience doesn't know. The process of deciding this needed to be a comic instead of prose, and then the process of transforming it and drawing it. Can you talk a little to that point?
Sure. So I knew from the moment I went to work in this restaurant in 1978 that this was a story that I was going to have to tell one day. It just lodged itself in my gut like right away, and I just had this, ooey visceral like thing where I knew it was going to lead to something, and I spent years thinking about it. I spent a lot of time with the restaurant manager, who's fictionalized in the story as Laszlo, who was really a truly great writer himself, and he and I discussed collaborating on a story about the restaurant. We both knew it was definitely a story, and we talked about it, and then finally, after 4 years, I left the restaurant and moved to New York, and he and I corresponded, and he wrote really wonderful letters and told me, kept me up to date on all the latest lurid scandals, and we never quite got around to it, and then he passed away, and I still spent years thinking about it and making lists of potential characters and incidents, episodes that had happened, and, trying to figure out how I could wrestle them into some kind of story. And I moved in 1990 with my husband to Los Angeles, and I thought, well, everyone who worked in the restaurant always thought of the place as being like a movie. It was just universal. Everyone knew this was like a movie. So I thought, well, I could write a screenplay. And then the longer I lived in LA, the more I realized that even if I wrote a screenplay, the odds of getting it produced were like slim to nothing. So the fact that Durf has managed to get a book made of My Friend Dahmer and it's a great movie, is really truly miraculous when you think of all the dreck that comes out of Hollywood. So I thought, okay, screenplay's out.
Unless there was a serial killer at the diner.
Yeah.
But
I should have thought to add that element. What was stupid. God. And then I thought, well, graphic novel, that's crazy. No one could ever do that much drawing. That's just insane. That's out the window. I thought, well, I'll just write it as a piece of fiction. So I did. I wrote it. I spent about 3 or 4 years wrestling it into a manuscript. And my agents took it around to all the major publishing houses in New York and could not sell it. And one editor had the temerity to say, has she considered doing this as a graphic novel? And I was just infuriated. How dare she say that? If I wanted to do it that way, I'd do it that way. God damn it! And finally, I had to break down and admit to myself that, that's what I do. This is who I am. Of course I have to do that. So I finally just had to break down and start drawing. And I had carefully crafted all these beautiful sentences describing everything the way I saw it, and of course all that description had to go out the window because now I was just drawing it. And I found yesterday during Chris Ware's presentation, talking about memory and how we don't really our memories don't really come to us in the form of moving pictures. They're more like snapshots. And that's really what I had in my mind, was a series of still images that I could see very clearly in my mind. And it was just a matter of putting them down on the page after page after page. So that's what I did.
And the 2 books combined to 700 pages plus of work. How did your art change over that time? What did you get better at, or what did you realize you didn't need to do over the course of a couple of years?
I didn't need to fill in the backgrounds quite as obsessively as I thought I had to do in the beginning, where I had to draw every coffee cup and, every little item sitting behind the counter on the shelf. Because it was just, who could do that much drawing?
Yeah, was it insane?
I got better at drawing backgrounds. That was figures. Drawing figures has never been a problem for me, but filling in the backgrounds and doing architectural details, and especially drawing cars, because I hate to draw cars. You kind of when you tackle a subject as big as this one, you kind of have to make your peace with drawing all the things you hate to draw, and then try to find a way to love drawing them so that comes across.
Hey, can you talk a little about the drawing and the painting process that goes into making these
Drawn
pages?
and Quarterly, they didn't just ask, they demanded that I separate the line from the tone, so because it prints much more crisply than if you just do all the artwork on one piece of paper. The black lines are sharper and the tones are richer. So that was kind of difficult to swallow, but I did it. It was really kind of a hideously arduous process because it involved drawing the line art on a piece of Bristol board, and because I don't work on the computer, then I would put it on a light box and put a piece of the thinnest watercolor paper there is, which is 90-pound watercolor paper, on top of the black line art, and turn off the lights and do the green washes over that. And so it's in the dark, so I'm just only like about 50% sure of what I'm doing at any given moment. I'm like, I guess okay.
Did it seem like a metaphor for how the whole project was going, or?
No, I mean, other than that, I felt pretty solid about the whole thing. I mean, I knew what the story was and I knew how I wanted it to look, but it was just frustrating to not have that control. But sometimes control just kind of goes out the window and you have to wing it. So.
Now, you've done shorter work since then in New Yorker, as well as New Yorker Online, as well as a few print venues. How does the writing process differ, writing into comics at that point, given that this came from a big prose work that you'd already worked through?
Well, in the past, when I've done shorter pieces for print, there's always the restriction, the size restriction. I mean, you're limited to in print, just a small amount of real estate on, any given page. So you have to reduce and reduce and reduce your story to an essential thing, and you throw out a lot of details you normally would want to keep. And in telling this, I got to make it just as long as I wanted to, and give the story the breathing room that I thought it needed to, and the pacing that I thought it needed, because they hadn't restricted me on page length or anything. So after this was done, and when I looked up, I looked up from my desk in the mid '90s and realized my career had gone off a cliff because of print was dying off, and I couldn't get arrested, and then 15 years later, here I am, working on this, and I finish it, and now print is even deader than a doornail, and I had been doing cartoons in the LA Times on their Sunday opinion page, but they gave me a 7x9 space, this little box to tell stories of very LA centric oddball stories. And that was frustrating. So working for the NewYorker.com was really great, because with webcomics, it's the same thing. You can just go as long as you want. So I was at this point, I was used to working, taking my time and pacing things the way I wanted to, having finished the book. So I was able to do 36 panels for a New Yorker piece that, people just eat it up like potato chips. They don't, they don't care. It's like, ooh, yeah, keep going. They're like, oh, it's done? What? It's over? And it's really liberating to be able to tell a story in the way you really want to, without feeling like you have to just pare it down to the most bare essentials.
And does it involve making some design choices in terms of not having the page as a unit?
Well, absolutely. I mean, yesterday in Billy Ireland, I was looking at these giant broadsheet old newspaper. One? Yeah, everything. Yeah. Anything full page, you're like, oh, to have that space to just stretch out. I used to have full pages in the Village Voice to do that with, and it was really fun. It was heavenly. And I miss that terribly. I just I wish. And I think there's a need for that. I think people would love to see big papers like that, and, collect them and have them and own them and look forward to getting them and holding them in their hands. But that aside, at least, I can tell these strange little stories that go on and on.
What do you miss most about the 70s?
Oh, boy.
Besides the cocaine.
I don't know.
Number one.
No, I really... first of all, I didn't do it that often. For the one thing, I was raised by depression baby parents who are the biggest tightwads ever. I say I come from the tribe of the tightwahati, and so I made the mistake once of going in on a bindle with some other waitresses, and I was like, $30 for that? For 15 minutes? No, I'm not going to do that again. And so, I watched while everyone else was like, squandering their paychecks and their tip money on this stupid drug, and it was like, yeah, no, I'm sitting this one out. So no, and cocaine was a really horrible drug that turns people into assholes. And it's kind of a gateway. It became, in my experience of watching everyone there, it became a gateway drug to heroin, and because at that point, people were such naive babies of like, oh no, but if you snort it, you can't get addicted.
You won't get hooked. Yeah.
And it just led to the downfall and the wasting of years of people's lives and a lot of pain and suffering. So kids, don't do drugs. No.
So something positive from the 70s?
No, I miss the fact that the sexual revolution was going on. Everyone was sleeping with everyone else. It was pre-AIDS, and there was no judgment passed on it, male or female. There was no walk of shame. It was like, if you wanted to experiment sexually and try to figure out who you were, you had that freedom to do so without, people, judging you for it. And if I did anything back then, it wasn't lots of drugs. It was lots of sex with lots of people I probably should have never bothered with. But at least it led me to a better understanding of who I was and what I really wanted in a relationship with someone. I learned a lot from those mistakes. And even though there was a lot of really horrible sexism in a way that was just like taken for granted, like, well, boys will be boys. They're just going to be like that. Like at the same time, it felt like it was kind of like the Wild West, like you could try anything. And there wasn't, it was fantastically unpolitically correct time. So there was lots of constant racist and sexist jokes going around and around, but people didn't take it as seriously. So, good. It's also the thing I don't miss about it. It was, and this is really what the book is about, is it was a kind of a moral swamp that you had to navigate your way through on your own. And in some respects, that was good because you had to just figure it out. So you didn't have the world at large saying, this is bad, like they do on Facebook, people are like, things you need to know, before. It just felt more open. And also it was a lot cheaper.
Yeah, that's a standard. Have you been hearing from some of the people whose lives you documented?
Interestingly, this time, not so much.
Yeah.
And they did, the people I worked with did very generously share their stories with me, which I then, took notes on and then reshaped and reassigned some of the players for. So I did that in service to this story because I didn't want it to be just straight up nonfiction. I wanted to mold it into more of a metaphor for the way things were rather than literal truth of who did what to when.
Hey, were there unreliable memoir templates you were going by, or were there writers or books that kind of helped you shape what this is going to be? As a story, I mean.
Well, I remember in the very beginning, starting out, Dave Eggers' book.
Heartbreaking Work, Staggering Genius.
That was I liked the tone of that, so that was kind of an inspiration. I'm trying to think.
There's always Mary Carr. People frequently fall back on Mary Carr.
Not so much that.
Yeah.
Well, I really love Fun Home was a huge inspiration in terms of just visually how it could look, because before that I was like, I couldn't quite picture in my mind what it would look like, and not only with her storytelling tone, but visually the look of her book, it suddenly made much more sense to me. Of like, oh, it could be kind of like that.
Yeah, were there other cartoonists you took lessons from, either in the process of this or as you were developing younger as a cartoonist? Have models, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, everyone from M.K. Brown to, old New Yorker stuff, R. Taylor from the New Yorker comics of the 30s and 40s, the beautiful the black and white ink washes.
Yeah.
And like Sid Hoff, just loved him. I always think later. I remember later who the influences were, but Charles Addams and I always draw a blank. It's so embarrassing.
Do you remember first experiences of meeting some of your
Oh,
cartooning
yeah.
artists?
So I actually was, one of the true stories of this book was I was working in this restaurant and I was submitting my work, which was being published in a local adult classified ads newspaper called The Spectator. That's why he said, "Oh, The Spectator, dude, your favorite." It was the sister publication of the Berkeley Barb, which had been this famous 60s firebrand radical newspaper. But by the late 70s, the Barb had sort of fallen on hard times and was basically being bankrolled by The Spectator. And I went in, someone told me to go see if they would buy my cartoons, so they did for a big $12 a week.
You're professional.
And so then I had clippings that I could send off to New York, and I sent them to the National Lampoon, which was a huge inspiration for me because their comics section in the 70s was just amazing. Everyone from Gay and Wilson to Sherry Flanagan and Sam Gross, Mary Kay Brown, and on and on. And Sherry, who was the cartoon editor there, started buying my work and then invited me to join them at Comic-Con in San Diego. And I had grown up going to Comic-Con because I was from San Diego. So I got in my 1969 Plymouth Satellite and I drove down to San Diego. And I got to spend 4 days hanging out with them and just showing them my hometown. And it was just like a dream come true. It was like just the best. And then Sherry invited me to stay with her in New York to come and visit. And then, I went, I made a couple of trips and figured out a way to, get my foot in the door. And the New Yorker cartoonist had it was either Tuesday or Wednesdays after they would submit their batches to the New Yorker, they would go out for lunch together, and they invited me to go along. And I met an illustrator named Roxy Monroe, who's still a very successful children's book illustrator. She was doing covers for the New Yorker at that point, and she was giving up a sublet and asked me if I wanted to take it over. So that was how I got there.
Is there we'll say an over easy, Customer's Always Wrong sequel about New York? No,
everyone wants to see Madge go to New York and party at Danceteria. But
it was the 70s and 80s.
I was never really a nighttime person. Madge you're not going to see Madge out with Jean-Michel Basquiat. It just wasn't happening.
Are there other...
Besides, I got there and I was happy. That's not, but conflict
not the stuff stories are made of.
Yeah, no, conflict is drama, and the conflict was pretty much over.
Yeah. Advice for younger cartoonists, besides keep your eyes open and live a little?
Find a sugar daddy. No, I think the dark secret of comics that no one ever wants to talk about is there's no money in it anymore. I used to, I made a good living in the 80s as a cartoonist, and that world is gone, and I'm very, very lucky to have a husband who has been willing to support this project, which is something that I felt like I needed to do before I died. And so I didn't have to take some crappy job, I could just stay at home and work on it. And I think it's the same is true of many cartoonists. They have someone in the background working to bring the money in so that they can do this really very labor-intensive process. So, I mean, it's the kind of thing where if there's a story you feel like you need to tell, it's like you're just compelled to do it, you got to find a way to make that work. You know, find someone who's willing to support you both emotionally and financially, or, you know, find grants, find, you know, means of support, because it's very difficult to make it happen otherwise.
And making time, getting yourself to the drawing table.
Well,
one thing when you were working on this book, but, you know, since then with subsequent projects, has it changed?
I think I'm more disciplined now than I used to be, for sure. I mean, it's become more of a muscle memory thing where it's like, you know, you find tricks to make yourself sit down and work. You sit there and you're watching Chris Ware talk about how he sits at his desk and he's filled with self-loathing, and I'm like, dude, like, what is wrong with you?
Self-loathing is fuel.
Well, I mean, everyone has that. I think of it as there being like a drawing demon and a drawing angel on either shoulder, and the drawing demon's like, oh, what made you think you could ever do this? You are disgusting. You are the lowest of the, like, who do you think you are? And then the drawing angel's like, no, really, that last, like, look at the way you drew that hand. That's so nice. And you have to just, like, shove the drawing demon out of the way and listen to the angel instead. And I mean, just in practical terms, I've learned that everyone fidgets, you know, and the conventional wisdom is stop fidgeting, don't do that. But fidgeting is actually what helps us focus. And if you keep like something like jelly beans or gummy bears, a cup of tea, a bottle of water at your desk to, like, you know, manage those moments, so you're not just like anything but sitting there and focusing on it, that keeps you in your chair. And like as long as you're in your chair in front of your drawing board, there's more of a likelihood that you're going to make a mark on a piece of paper at some point than if you're off, like, you know, like wiping down the baseboards. Yeah. And then for me personally, I can't have music if I'm trying to write or do rough sketches where I'm really having to intensively focus on what I'm doing. But once I'm inking or doing color or washes, I can have like podcasts or like yours in the background, or audiobooks or something, and that keeps me stuck in my chair too. So that's what works for me.
Yeah, I will point out that the number of cartoonists who told me they listened to my conversations with other cartoonists while inking is way up there. So if you are a cartoonist, I'll give you a link to the show. Last question before we start taking questions from you guys. Are you happy not to be using Viridian anymore? That color, that's the tone for the...
I'm fine with it. Someone actually just asked me to use it again for a short piece for an anthology I just did. And I was like, fine.
It's the Mimi color. I guess you're you know, that'll wash it. What is your next color, by the way? What's that?
I don't know. Okay. That's up to my hairdresser. Only he knows for sure.
So let's open the floor. Do you guys have questions for Mimi? Did you find sexism as prominent within cartooning?
Oh, not at all.
I was going to say at Sherry and M.K. Brown and people like that were successes.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was partly, I think as women cartoonists, we were kind of seen as a novelty act, like, you know, it was, and also male cartoonists were like such gigantic nerds that they were just happy to have girls around at all. So it's like, yeah, come join the club. Yeah, sure. Come and sit down. So, no, I found it actually a very welcoming atmosphere for the most part. I would say, you know, 99% of other male cartoonists at that point were very welcoming and friendly and generous.
Other questions?
I just have a question about process. You said you took it from prose to graphic novel. Did you kind of thumbnail the whole thing out first, or did you do it page by page?
Well, I thought, I mean, not so much thumbnail, but like definitely rough sketches for every page. So it wasn't like I was doing little tiny things, because I need it to be bigger so I can. But yeah, everything definitely is roughed out beforehand. But it was like Chris Ware was talking about, like memory as snapshots. It was I definitely had it already like pretty much lodged in my brain. Although there is a point at which, when you're like doing a work of this length, where you're trying to pace it, where it's obviously not going to be like, oh, of course I remember snapshot by snapshot, frame by frame. You like have to figure out how to pace things, and like with movies, you have a two shot and a long shot and a reverse shot, and I think there's a lot to be learned from watching movies about pacing a story. That's a really great asset for any cartoonist in terms of storytelling.
I heard you say that John and Quarterly made some demands on the artwork before the book was finished. Had they agreed to publish it before you?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, they agreed to publish it after I gave them about 60 pages. But they didn't really. They had some copy editing changes at the end, but other than that, they pretty much left me alone, which was great. They trusted me.
Imagine.
I
was going to ask, in relation to the previous question, in that first book, you do have a couple of design tricks, certain, just graphic elements. In book 2, it's really straight.
Yeah, I just in terms of pacing, I think the narrative had picked up a certain speed, and I didn't want to slow that down with any kind of graphic tricks of like showing. It felt like showing off. Like, let's just stop and like do these.
The coffee cup with the prose circling around.
Yeah, but it was like there was time for that in the first part, but by the time the second one had come along, you kind of just wanted to see the action move forward. I think that's how I felt.
With your early influences of Taylor and Hoff and those guys, did you ever pursue the single panel New Yorker style?
It's just not my forte. Like I said, if I could take 36 panels to tell a story, I'm going to do it. It's really a whole different art form of reducing something down to one panel and the perfect phrase, the perfect caption to go with it. I mean, that's a real specific art unto itself.
Is there a magazine you wish you'd been? Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask. So when you're talking about collecting the stories for the first 2 books, were you pulling just the stories from what you had in your own memory and experience, or did you actually go back to some of those people?
Oh no, I went back and talked to a lot of the people I worked with, and got a lot of information from them. And like I said, I didn't necessarily. Sometimes I just strip mine those stories and gutted them for parts, and put them back in my own little Frankenstein.
Were you always looking for like specific stories around like a specific like this is how I remember this thing? Like, do you remember that thing that happened, or do you kind of just let them talk, or does it just depend on the person?
Kind of both, but after I left the restaurant, actually the whole drug culture thing got a lot worse, and there was stuff that went on. Also, stuff that went on while I was working there that I had no idea that was happening, because I was that sort of young and dumb. And I was like, I'm going to save up my money and go to New York and be an artist. Meanwhile, there's just this major turmoil and drug drama going on that I was completely oblivious to. And then years later, they're like, oh yeah, we were all heroin addicts. And I'm like, what?
That explains so much. Yeah. Other questions?
Did you also have a diary?
No, I didn't keep a diary. I grew up with two brothers, and I lived in fear that anything I wrote down would be discovered. So I never had the habit of keeping a diary. People have asked if I drew while I was on the job, and there's no time to sketch while you're being a waitress. I'm sorry, that's a nice fantasy, but I did keep sketchbooks, and I did draw then, and what I was doing for my artwork then, besides making comics, was doing these pastel drawings of Oakland, which I really did. That whole thing with the cocaine dealers, they really did buy my artwork, and it helped sort of bankroll my way out of town. But there's more to that story and those characters later on in the book too. There's sort of an impetus for me to leave town.
Magazine you wish you'd been published in before it went away?
Oh.
You were in Spy, right?
No, I never was. I would have loved to have been in Spy. Yeah. I loved Spy. The magazines when they were big, like Vogue. Vogue never published comics, but they were big. Magazines were big. People forget about that. I mean, I don't think was the New Yorker ever bigger?
No, I think it was always
but everything else was big. Saturday Evening Post and Ladies' Home Journal and all those Collier's and Look and Life.
So that could be your next project, doing 11 by 17 giant comics.
Yeah.
It's something to aspire to. Any last questions? We'll call the spotlight to a
all
halt.
Right.
Everybody, thank you. Go by over easy, and the customer is always wrong.
And that was Mimi Pond. Her new book is The Customer is Always Wrong, from Drawn and Quarterly, and that's a sequel to her book Over Easy, and they're some pretty fantastic comics. Mimi's website is mimipond.com, MIMIPOND. She's on Twitter as Pimimond, PIMIMOND, and her Instagram is mimipondovereasy, all one word. And I did not get to ask either of them, so who are you reading? So there's no Fear of a Square Planet bonus podcast material that's going to come out of CXC, but that said, I did record this in Columbus, Maryland. I used travel miles to cover the flight, but the hotel did come out to $450 for 2 nights, plus another 50 or 60 in Lyft fares to get around and meals, etc. So it was a pretty pricey trip. Still, it got me away from worrying about my conference and my day job, and I got to meet some neat people and have some great conversations. Still, if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, etc., or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. And you can make a one-time or recurring donation. Special thanks go out to Kevin Katila, John Wendler, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Stephen Nadler, Wallace Wilde Minozzi, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Garrett Zecker, Craig P. Steffen, Jack Lescamella, and Ron Slate for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Oh, and I just updated the template for that website, so go check it out because it's got this really amazing header image. I had to do 2,000 pixels by 1,200, and I did these little headshots of like 150 guests, and they're all in there. You take a look. You're going to plots when you see it. Just go to chimeraobscura.com/VM. Now, music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. And that's it for this week's Virtual Memories show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with author John Crowley. Until next time, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store or at soundcloud.com/VMSpod. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, on Facebook at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and at YouTube by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this show, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and review for this podcast. That'll help us build a bigger audience. Till next time, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.